New York State has released a new paid sick leave law that is going to impact most, if not every, employer in the state. And so we have a very special episode of PeopleWork. We have repeat guest, labor law attorney Kevin Wicka from the Tarantino Law Firm in Buffalo, New York, as well as Complete Payroll's very own CEO, Austin Fish. We're going to have a little bit of a roundtable discussion. We're going to look at this law from a legal perspective as well as a business owner's perspective, so that hopefully by the end of this, whoever is watching, you have a good idea of what this law is, how it's going to be rolled out, and what options you may have as an employer to ensure compliance and best practices. So really excited to have this conversation. Let's dive right in. First off, Kevin, Austin, thanks for coming on. How you doing?
Hi CJ, glad to be here. Looking forward to another episode of PeopleWork. Hopefully we can educate your clients and employers out there on this new paid sick leave law for New York State.
Thanks, CJ. I appreciate you inviting me on the show to make my debut and to help share some of my experiences as a business owner with everyone as well.
All right, so we're going to dive right into it. Kevin, let's start with you. Can you provide a basic overview of this law in broad brushstrokes, especially for those employers out there who are trying to make sense of it?
Sure. So New York State passed a new paid sick leave law. And let's clarify that, because it's not paid for everyone. It's going to depend, it's a sliding scale depending on the size of the employer. So employers that have 4 or fewer employees that under $1 million of revenue have to provide at least 40 hours of unpaid leave to their employees. Once they go over $1 million of revenue, that leave becomes paid. And that same size would be applicable for employers of 5 to 99 employees would have up to 40 hours of paid sick leave. Once an employer exceeds in size over 100, the threshold then goes up to 56 hours of paid leave. And so the accruals are going to begin on September 30th. That's when employees can begin accruing time. And that will go into effect that they can start using it on January 1 of 2021.
That's a great overview. Okay, so we have employers, we start accruing September 30th, 2020. That's just a couple of weeks from now. And they're going to start using it on January 1st. Basically, for 5 to 99 employees and over $1 million, 40 hours of paid sick leave per year. So that's interesting. That was never mandated before. One question I have quickly is, what happens if an employer already has that built into their policy? Whether it's they have it specifically, they have it accounted for in their policy, or they just have a general PTO and that includes paid sick leave.
So it's going to become a little more complicated, because over the last few years, we've seen a trend of employers getting away from designating vacation pay versus sick time. And it may be time to revisit that. Instead of just classifying everything as PTO, it might be beneficial to break those two into separate, distinct categories. If you have a policy as an employer that already covers what is required, then that's fine. But I would still recommend speaking to someone that can really take a look at your policies, someone like Complete Payroll, for example, to make sure that in fact that you are in compliance and that your employees have an understanding. Because there are some different things, which I'm sure we'll talk about too, as far as record keeping and how accruals are made. So you want to make sure that that existing policy is in fact in compliance.
Well, it's interesting you bring that up, and thanks for the shout out. Obviously, we appreciate that. But Austin, I know for a fact, when I first started working at Complete Payroll, one of the things that I knew is that in the past, for Complete Payroll's own employees, I know that we used to break down the different categories of paid time off, whether it be vacation, sick, or other thing. But over time, eventually the business made the decision to just put everything into one, large bank of PTO, use it however you want, that type of thing. This, as Kevin is saying, this sounds like it. I mean, maybe no decisions have been made yet, but it sounds like employers like Complete Payroll may want to rethink that, right? How, from a business owner who already went through the change to kind of simplify the process to general PTO, how are you responding to this as somebody who's trying to make sense of it all and make the right decision for, to comply and for your employees?
Yeah, it's funny because, like you said, we went from having both sick and vacation time to lumping everything together as a PTO bucket where we drew everything from. Now, our policy is thankfully greater than what the state mandates and everything else, so we would be able to use that going forward, except for the fact that it's based off of anniversary date. And as we were just told, it has to be a calendar from January 1st. So now we're looking at splitting back out the sick time from our PTO time. And then now what do we do with our PTO time? Do we leave that on anniversary? And we have to explain to our staff before January 1 what's going to be happening at that point in time. Because there's different rules that apply with this one. But what is very important is that your handbook represents exactly what your policies are. As Kevin had alluded to, a lot of us out there have gone over the years of just copying and pasting different policies from the internet, what we thought was good, but you got to be really careful on that too, because you might inadvertently put yourself into more government scrutiny than you need. For example, if you took the federal FMLA law and you copy and pasted that in there, but you're under 50 employees, now you have to follow those rules when it's only mandated for employers over 50.
So I'm glad you brought that up. So clearly, like, as evidenced by your response right there, as somebody who runs a business, you're thinking about a lot of different things. There are a lot of things that impact this. One of these, though, obviously, is the fact that, okay, first of all, our current policy is more simplified in the sense that it's general PTO. But it also, right, is more than satisfies what this new law is stipulating. So it's not like Complete Payroll is in a position where it's going to have to, carve out more PTO or sick time than it was already offering its employees. But it does need to first go about like recategorizing that, right? Because the law says that it's going to require employers to prove that this time was being offered to their employees. Now, Kevin, I have a question for you. There may be a lot of businesses in a situation like Complete Payroll, or maybe they're already offering it, but it's through a general bank of PTO that could be used in a variety of ways. Now they have to go back and prove that they're offering it specifically for sick leave. Do you have any recommendations for best practices on how they would go about doing this?
So it's going to be important that you have good record keeping. So for a couple of reasons. For one, the statute requires that if an employee asks, even verbally, as to how much sick leave time that they have, that you have to give that to them within 3 days. Okay, and so you also have a requirement under the statute to maintain the records for up to 6 years. So as far as a best practice, it's going to be important that you have a system in place that's able to comply with those things. And a further reason to consider breaking them apart would be what happens when an employee leaves at the end of their employment. So under New York law, an employer that doesn't provide any rule as far as what happens with vacation pay is required to pay it out. With regard to this paid sick leave time, there is no requirement that it be paid out to an employee upon leaving. So it might be another reason to consider breaking the two apart.
Got it. Okay, so I also read something in there about carryover, right? So how does unused sick leave carry over on an annual basis?
So the statute does provide for carryover to be permitted. So at the end of the year, if someone has not used their time, they can carry over their 40 hours. The question then is what happens? I do not believe in reading the statute that they would be able to accrue more than 40 hours for the following year. One of the things that I do think is important to point out here, CJ, is the fact that we don't have regulations yet from the Department of Labor that further interpret the statute. So all the more reason to stay tuned to this issue because there could be some modifications and changes as we go down the line.
Okay. Something else, I'm not really sure, to be honest, if there's much that can be said here, but I got to imagine a lot of other businesses are in the same position that Complete Payroll is, the way Austin characterized it, right? Right now they have a general PTO policy that can be used in a variety of ways that is already more generous than what this new paid sick leave law is mandating. However, it's not based on the calendar year. It renews throughout the employee's anniversary. Right? So have you, I don't know if there's a best practice for shifting your benefits to move from a calendar year to an anniversary, or I guess my general question is, have you seen a lot of your clients or just employers in general make these transitions from anniversary based to calendar based, and if so, like what do you have to say about this law's impact on that?
I haven't seen a lot yet. I think as we get closer, people are going to have to clarify that issue. And it really is going to become complicated, I think, to use 2 different dates. So it might be a best practice to go to just a calendar year in light of this particular rule. But depending if they do break apart the vacation pay versus the sick time, it might be useful to keep them separate. I think it's going to be really different on a case-by-case basis for each employer, but it certainly is another requirement of several that have been put on employers in recent years due to some different changes that we've had to deal with.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad that's literally a perfect segue, because I want to get both you and Austin involved in something that Austin brought up earlier. So you talked about how there have been a lot of changes in recent years in New York State labor law. I mean, you're talking about paid family leave, sexual harassment prevention, now paid sick leave, right? There's been more, right? But those have really been the big ones. You talked about record keeping and documentation being really important. Austin brought up earlier the importance of keeping everything in an employee handbook, right? So what advice would you have for employers, Kevin, when it comes to either adopting a new employee handbook or keeping it up to date, considering that this really needs to be reflected in there, because it is a formal company policy, because now it is, of course, mandated by the state. So could you talk about the importance of an up-to-date employee handbook?
Absolutely. Think of it as like, in medicine terms, making sure you have your annual physical from your physician. It's preventative medicine. And there can be a temptation, especially in light of all of the different strains that have been put on businesses, especially over the past 6 months with COVID, to save a little bit of money and think, well, I'll do my own handbook. And as Austin mentioned, that you can opt into laws that you don't need to obligate yourself to. FMLA is a good example of that. And you want to make sure that you have these proper policies in place. And so making sure that you have the proper handbook is so important. And more importantly, that when you have these policies, you have to know that you have them and you have to enforce them. Because otherwise you've created this record to show potential regulators or potential plaintiffs that may come back and sue you that these are the rules and you haven't been following them. So it's a 2-part process. 1, make sure you have it, and 2, make sure you follow it.
Yeah. So I want to go back to, I want to get Austin's take a little bit on the employee handbook. You brought up, you talked about the importance of employee handbooks. Austin, you're the CEO of a company that provides employee handbook services to its clients, but also, that has, meets a lot of, federal employment thresholds, over 50 employees for the FMLA, and, really maintaining the employee handbook is important for the company you run as well. So you run up against this a lot. What advice would you have for employers who, maybe just want to make sure that they're staying up to date, they're staying compliant, and how that relates to their employee handbook?
Yeah, no, we definitely go through and we're constantly looking at our handbook throughout the year. But as Kevin mentioned, doing it at least once a year is the best way to keep up on top of it, because even with our employees going more remote, for Complete Payroll's instance, when COVID hit, we ended up shutting down some of our offices temporarily and making it more accessible to work from home. You should have good policies in place before you do those things. COVID obviously pushed things a little bit faster than most people reacted to, but now that it's been 6 months and people have been doing this, you really should make sure you have standards put in place. So before you're questioned or before certain precedents get set, because without a handbook, it's what precedent are you doing? So making sure that you have things put in place beforehand will help protect your organization. And that's what a lot of those things are for, is protection for the organization and for the employees. So they know what they can do, what they can't do.
That's a great point. We came in here to talk about New York State paid sick leave law, but when you think about it, again, in recent years we've had paid family leave, sexual harassment prevention, now paid sick leave, and now so many employers adopting new remote work policies. There's probably been a lot of changes to one's employee handbook, right? And if they haven't, right, there's a lot of cause for keeping that updated. And one of the things that, Kevin, you impressed upon me earlier in the past is how the handbook is more than just a way to proactively communicate employer policies, although it certainly is that. But in many cases, it could be the first line of defense in the event of legal action taken toward the company. And as I understand it, there's even some laws where they require certain policies to be documented in the employee handbook, right? Just to keep the employer protected.
Absolutely. So you referenced New York State's sexual harassment law. New York State has a policy that is a model policy that every employer has to meet at least that minimum. And it is a robust policy. It's several pages, so it is important that that be up to date. Further, there are other policies that for other potential claims that if you have them and you have an avenue of complaint for your employees and an employee fails to take advantage of it, that it may be an affirmative defense then for the employer. Yeah. So that's an important argument as well to have. So it has a practical purpose and a legal purpose as well. And they're both, it's a win-win for the employees. It's good for the employees to have an understanding of what rights they have, what protections they have, and it also protects the employer. And it creates a good work environment, which makes your people more productive, and it allows you to function as a business better. So it's a win-win all around.
Great. So Austin, I have a couple, one or two questions for you before we wrap up. So I obviously know you to be obviously the CEO of Complete Payroll. I know you to be somebody who understands the importance of labor law compliance, and also I know you to be somebody who wants to make the workplace as positive and beneficial to employees as possible. In other words, I know you from history wanting to give as much to your employees as you can. Now, what is your take on this new law? Do you think sometimes laws will come into effect and they kind of push some lagging employers forward in terms of offering more benefits and things like that, but it's also possible that sometimes laws make it harder for employees who are already out ahead of that to provide benefits to the employees. What is your take on this law as how it will function in terms of helping employees take that protected sick leave?
Yeah, thank you for that. And yes, we're always constantly trying to do our best for our employees and everything else, because having a good, healthy culture in the office makes life at work that much better. But yeah, I think for most larger employers, this will just be more of a task, just something to kind of comply to. They probably already have stuff in place for it. But on your smaller employers, your ones with less than $1 million in revenue, 4 or fewer, trying to track all that time and everything else could be a lot of administrative burden for them as well. We can definitely try and help them as a payroll company. I'm sure there's plenty of people out there who can. But there's certain things that, we're not going to be able to know, like, did you cross over the threshold of $1 million? And there's a lot of guidance that isn't out yet. As Kevin mentioned before, they haven't defined things yet. Like, what is an employee? Part-time, full-time? What happens if you have 4 employees, you go to 5 for a month, and you go back down to 4 after that? Is it an average of how many employees you have throughout the year? There's a lot of things that we still need some clarification on. And yes, we hope to be there to help our clients get through all of that, especially the smaller ones that need the clarification and need the help to understand and need the tracking, as you had mentioned before. It's 6 years, whether you're tracking that through a timekeeping or through your payroll, you need to make sure that's going to be available if you're asked to provide those documents.
So again, you run a business that helps a bunch of employees all throughout the country, but obviously the majority of which in New York State, meet payroll, HR, timekeeping, labor law compliance objectives, right? So you regularly interact with a lot of business owners or managers within a business for whom labor law compliance is a priority. So what would you say, as you've acknowledged that there's a lot that we know, and we could speculate about the best practices for complying, there's a lot that we don't know, we need to kind of stay up to date. At the same time, this law goes into effect on September 30th, which is just a few weeks from right now. So what advice, general advice or specific, would you give to employers out there who want to continue to do right by their employees, but also need to make sure that they comply with the law and everything like that?
Yeah, make sure you're starting to track the accruals at the end of this month. It starts September 30th. It's not at the beginning of next month. It's at the end of this month. So I say that, and it's still August right now. But yeah, September 30th, start tracking now. And then you have between September and January to decide what your end policy is going to be. But make sure you update all of your handbooks or whatever kind of policies and procedures you have at your office, and make sure it's well communicated to your employees. For liability standpoint, if you give them it and ask them politely to sign off in acknowledgement of what the new policies are, this can just help keep you in a good area across the board, liabilities considered.
So Kevin, I want to ask you the same question. But before we do that, there was one thing that I noticed about the law that we kind of glossed over. So let's make sure we hit that really quickly, if you think it's worth clarifying. When I was looking at the overview of the law, I saw a lot of text and bullet points about the reasons for leave that somebody could take. Is there anything that, I mean, without having to like list off every single thing that could qualify as a reason for leave? Because the way I understand it, right, the employer cannot ask why somebody is taking the leave, and could be for an illness that is diagnosed or undiagnosed, and there's a lot of variables that could justify somebody to take this leave. As far as employers are concerned, is there anything they need to know that falls outside of the norm for reasons why somebody could take this paid sick leave?
Good point. I do think that is very important, and we should not gloss over that at all. So as you noted, there does not have to be an official diagnosis. So the individual does not have to have been diagnosed with something. It is not like getting a medical certification for FMLA leave. This is much more lenient than that. Importantly as well, it could be a medical condition related to a family member, and that's a pretty broadly defined term as well within the statute. And another area that's different that we really haven't seen as much in other leave laws is there's a whole provision that addresses a legal proceeding, someone needing to take time off as part of a domestic violence legal proceeding, whether it be civil or criminal, a family offense. There's a whole series of different rules with regard to that. So there's a much more broad area in which an employee can use this leave time than what we've seen in other statutes.
So, I mean, guys, we've covered a lot, right? We've covered the stipulations of the law, right, based on revenue and employee count thresholds, whether that leave is paid or unpaid, and whether it's 40 hours a week or 56. We've talked about how it accrues on the calendar year as opposed to by work anniversary. Accrues 1 hour every 30 hours worked. Law goes into effect September 30th. The employees can start taking this leave on January 1st, 2021. We've hit the reasons for leave. And we talked about the importance of why this is job protected. Employers can't inquire. They can't penalize anybody for taking this leave. And we also, I think, hit some really valuable topics on the importance of documentation, employee handbooks, and other matters related to compliance. Kevin, do you think, based on everything we covered, is there anything else that you think we should add or that you want employers to understand as this plays out?
I think the biggest thing is that it's really difficult because there is a lot of overlap with other things. So, for example, I referenced that this law also covers medical conditions for family members. Well, New York put in to place a couple years ago the paid family leave law. So there could be an overlap between an employee that might be able to use this law instead of that law, or that might be a more appropriate one. If you're a large enough employer, as you noted earlier, 50 or more employees, family medical leave still is a unpaid leave that's available to employees. So there's really a lot there that's a challenge for, especially as Austin noted, a smaller employer to keep track of. So I think that's important to note, that with all of these different policies, you just want to make sure that you have them in place, and it's helpful to have someone that can guide you through that. I think that's really important because it's a lot of running a business for employers these days, especially the smaller ones.
Well, Kevin and Austin, thank you both so much. I really appreciate it. So wherever you're watching this video, on our website, on YouTube, we are going to provide a link to, if you have any more follow-up questions, we're going to provide a link to get in touch with Kevin and ways to get in touch with all of us here at Complete Payroll. So thank you both for your time. I think this was really helpful, and we'll look forward to the next time.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, CJ. Thanks for having me. Thank you, Austin.
Wow, that was such a great conversation between labor law attorney Kevin Wicka and Complete Payroll CEO Austin Fish on the new New York State paid sick leave law. We did a great job breaking down that law and the impacts it may have on employers. Look, if you have any questions for Kevin or for Austin, or if you want to provide any feedback about that discussion, if you want to submit a topic for a future PeopleWork episode, or if you want to be a guest, we would absolutely love to hear from you. Just shoot us an email at peoplework@completepayroll.com, and we'll be sure to get back to you as soon as we can. Thanks so much.